So our second speaker is someone I'm very, very excited about. Jeff Jarvis is the Leonard Tao Professor of Journalism Innovation at the City University of New York's Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. There he's developed new degrees in entrepreneurial journalism, social journalism, and news innovation and leadership. He's the author of several books that are really great that I love. Geeks Bearing Gifts, Public Parts, What Will Google Do, and one of my favorites, Gutenberg the Geek. He's the co-host of This Week in Google. And actually, This Week in Google is probably one of the leading inspirations for my entire podcasting career. He blogs at buzzmachine.com. Previously, he was the president of advanced.net. Very pleased to welcome Jeff Jarvis to Reset Everything.
Sebastian, thank you. Congratulations on putting this together. It's been quite amazing. Sorry for the technical glitches. I'm now on a reliable Chromebook instead of my Mac. So I'm here to talk about media and what we've learned in this crisis. And I think that we moved from a period where we were worried about disinformation and Russian bots and Trumpists and all of that, and our enemy was disinformation. Now Claire Wardle, who's the head of the founder of First Draft, says that much of the disinformation we see is coming accidentally almost from ignorance. And we know what to do with ignorance. The cure for ignorance is not fact-checking. The cure for ignorance is expertise. And so in the last crisis, we were worried about not amplifying disinformation. In this crisis, I think we have to worry about amplifying expertise. And as a result, I went and created in very little time a COVID Twitter list. You can go find it at bit.ly/COVID Twitter list, where I have more than 500 epidemiologists, virologists, infectious disease physicians, researchers of all kinds who are attacking this disease with their expertise, with their experience. It has been amazing for me. It's the one thing that gives me hope, because science. And in watching the scientists work on this, I've been fascinated to see how they have adapted their mechanisms to a new open information ecosystem. And I think that there are many lessons from medicine here, not only for our health, but also for media. So first and foremost is that in this open information ecosystem that is the internet, we in journalism, I should say, are no longer the deliverers of information. The information is already delivered. We have to figure out, how do we add value to that? So if you look at medicine today, working in a world of preprints, that is to say, scientific papers that have not been peer reviewed, have not been published, but are being put up on preprint servers. What we're finding is that there is a huge amount of data, 4,000 papers being done so far, last I looked, more than that now. Some of them are crap. Some of them are useful. And so I've watched how the scientists have dealt with this, and I've seen 5 things that they had to do. They needed a system for openness, right? They needed an ethic that said that we should be open. And what we're seeing now is that the expensive peer-reviewed publications are, for the good of society, putting papers out in front. And the preprints are putting information out in front for the public to see, for medicine and scientists to see, without high paywalls. So openness and transparency is the first thing. The next is organization and discovery. If you have 4,000, 5,000 papers, you can't find them. I've seen 4 or 5 really interesting efforts so far to try to create a taxonomy around these papers, to try to organize them by topic, to make them more searchable, more discoverable. That's the second problem of an open information ecosystem. The third, which is absolutely critical, is peer review, to separate the wheat from the chaff, the crap from the rest. And what's fascinating to me is that I've seen doctors and scientists use Twitter for peer review at the speed of the internet. They have been coming right on top of papers and saying what they think. Now, there is the famous example now of the hydroxychloroquine paper with a very small N study that got out of a preprint. It was published by the editor of the journal, which itself is a problem. And then it got onto Twitter, and then it got into Donald Trump's brain, and it got out of his mouth, and it got into the bodies of some people out there. And that's the danger of preprints, yes. But let me give you, but even then, the scientists were jumping onto that study saying, don't pay attention to this at this stage. This is not something you act upon yet. It is one tiny, tiny data point. Worth looking at, fine, but not worth acting on. There was another study that was done by John Ioannidis on Santa Clara serology, that is testing the blood for the antibodies. And it got much attention, but it also got much criticism. And Ioannidis is a Stanford professor, so he has credentials, he has respect, but he's also very controversial. Within hours of his study going up onto preprint servers, there were detailed threads by epidemiologists and virologists going through the details of the study and, frankly, respectfully tearing it apart and saying that, again, it was not actionable. Well, again, the problem is media are not doing a good job of following this, but I'll get back to that. My point is that if you want to try to find how this thing is covered by scientists, it is not difficult to find the experts and to listen to the experts and to get into dialogue with them. I feel guilty every time I ask them a question because I'm taking them away from their important work, but they very much want to answer questions. Now, there was a New York Times story about this same study, the same serology study from California. And it took the word of the scientist who wrote the study and left it at that. It was a terrible job. It would not have been at all hard for the writer, a science writer, to have gone into Twitter, to have found 5 threads that I've linked to that criticize the study, to have shown that, as ever in science, it's about dialogue, it's about testing presumptions, not just accepting them. But journalism has a very bad habit of taking the latest word as the last word. And you see that in coverage all the time. Wine will kill you, wine will save you the next day, because we don't understand how to communicate science as process. Now, I was about to worry about coverage of this study elsewhere in journalism because newspapers are taking their now former sports reporters and entertainment reporters and putting them on the COVID beat. So I went and looked at the San Jose Mercury News just randomly. It had an excellent version of this, going into the controversy, going into the context, saying how this scientist's findings are being used by the "it's only flu" crowd and the "open up" crowd, and giving a political as well as a scientific context. It is possible to do good reporting, but you've got to find the experts. So 1, we have to have openness, 2, organization, 3, peer review. The 4th thing we need is peer review of the peers. Who is qualified to speak on this? Who is has the credentials and the expertise and the experience to do this? What we're also finding in Twitter is that it gets a little uncomfortable, but the scientists are criticizing each other. And they've come to me and said, watch out for that one, watch out for that one. And we do see people who are being perhaps charlatans, trying to get a lot of Twitter attention and a lot of traffic on this. We see people who have political agendas, but the scientists are wary of that. They watch out for each other. The 5th thing we need is the skill of explanation. Scientists tend to believe they're not very good at scientific communication, and they think they need journalists. And so they take training in science communications. Well, I think that perhaps they should trust themselves more, and it's the journalists who need to change. So in all of this, what we see is a new ecosystem in which there's open information already freely flowing with the preprints, and we see a social system in which scientists and doctors and people on the front line can discuss this openly. And we bring those together at a very important time where it is critical to have a view of the science as we go. I interviewed 4 scientists in this to understand what they think journalists should be doing. One of them, Angela Rasmussen from Columbia, said that the last time she worked in an epidemic, there were no preprint servers. It took a year for the earliest papers to come out. Well, imagine that today. Imagine if we had to wait that long to try to get the information that we need. So that's one example of a new reality. Now, it doesn't mean that anything is fundamentally new here. There was another paper, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the author at hand, that looked at the history of peer review recently and said that peer review goes back to Cicero and his own editors. Peer review is thought to go back to the first scientific journals in the 17th century. Peer review is thought to go back to the Cold War as a standard. The word peer review, the phrase peer review didn't come in until the 60s and 70s. But the point is that going all the way back to Cicero, there was a need. There was a need to be able to find and judge information and judge the judges of the information. And people adapted to the tools available. So now we have new tools available. We have this open system, and the scientists are adapting to it. We in journalism are not adapting that well, in my view. Yes, we're doing videos for the web, we're doing other things, but we haven't really adapted to the idea that we are no longer the gatekeepers. We are no longer the deliverers of information. We live in a world where there is tons of information out there, and we have to help people by figuring out how to add value to that. Now, at the same time, of course, we have a business that was already collapsing. The house was already on fire, and COVID has thrown gasoline onto that fire. We are, not to take this metaphor too far, but we are going to see severe collapse in the news business. We now have a case where every major newspaper chain in the United States is controlled by hedge funds, and we know where that goes. Their interests are, I'm not anti-capitalist. It's just the reality of what hedge funds do. They're going to act like hedgies. They're going to suck money out of these institutions. They're not going to invest. They're not going to improve. And that's where the legacy industry is going to go. Now, we see magazines in much the same shape in their industry. We see international newspapers suffering not quite as badly in Europe, for example, as the US, but it's dire, because I know that major chains there that I've talked to, major publications, have digital revenue running about 10% or less, which means they were dependent upon their paper revenue, and the delivery structure right now is collapsed. The advertising structure has collapsed. Subscriptions are up in many cases, but I think that's a COVID bump that, like the Trump bump, will not last forever. And other revenue streams that were out there that we were starting to explore as an industry now disappear. Events were a wonderful revenue stream that a lot of publications were working on, but that obviously is gone right now. Commerce, that was working in small ways as well, but with the collapse of retail, that's a problem. There was also an effort to get philanthropy, but there is only so much charity in the world. There were efforts to get contributions from readers. Stat News, which is a brilliant medical publication out of the Boston Globe, is now accepting contributions, which I think is a great idea. I contributed to them because I value them. I'm not a subscriber because I'm not a doctor, but by God, I need them now and I want to contribute. McClatchy, the newspaper company, just started accepting contributions. That's not going to save us, but we should give people the opportunity to give. And then finally, government support, I'm allergic to, because in the United States, 2 words, Donald Trump. That my British friends have always said, yes, but the BBC works with government support, but now there's 2 words, Boris Johnson. There is no messiah for where we are as media. Nothing is going to save us, per se. All messiahs we've had to date are false messiahs. And I think we're going to see a utter destruction of much of what we value in journalism. And then we've got to figure out what comes next. And I don't think what comes next is trying to save what we had. There's principles that we save, absolutely, but we have to find new ways to work in this new information ecosystem. And I think that's going to start in small sprouts that are going to be failures to a great measure. I've been doing study of the history of printing and of newspapers. And after Gutenberg invented or popularized, we should say, it was already invented in Korea and China without his knowledge, but after movable type became an industry in about 1450, it took a century and a half until 1605 before the first regularly published newspaper came out in Strasbourg. A century and a half to develop that, what we would think is a self-evident thing. Now, I would argue that we're only 25 years away from the introduction of the commercial web in October of 1994. So we're at the year 1475 in Gutenberg time. We don't know what the internet is yet. We don't know what is to come next. And so it's hard to say that we already know what succeeds and what fails. It's hard to say that we know what to invest in and what not to invest in. It's hard to think that we know the rules of where things are. We have to invent and invest. After those first newspapers started as a development out of news ballads, news poems, news books, news pamphlets, all kinds of things that roiled around until the newspaper came along, basically as a printed newsletter, an updated version of handwritten, expensive newsletters that had existed. There was a development that created the newspaper. It depended upon other developments like a postal service that spread across Europe that allowed both news and news reports to follow everywhere. And so we see that there was this effort at development we're going to have to go through now. Keep in mind that even after that first newspaper in 1605, many of the first newspapers, most of the first newspapers failed. The first one in Strasbourg stayed around for more than 50 years, but most of those that followed were experiments that came and went. We are going to have a tolerance in the news business and the media business for risk right now as we invent and try new things. And I think that those new things will come at a very small level. There are projects that I like, one called Spaceship Media in California by a woman named Eve Perlman, convenes communities into conversation, which I think is the essence of what journalism really is. There are other efforts that I see that try to understand how to do simple service journalism locally or simple transparency journalism locally. And so I think that there are innovators out there who are trying, but the business model is not going to be evident. It is not going to be clear. So we're going to have to start at a small scale. So I want to say one last thing, and then I'm eager for the discussion, having wasted some time with my computer problems. We in media tend to look at the world godlike in our image, and we think everything looks like media. So the internet to us looks like a medium. If you think about it, if I had a PowerPoint slide, and you're welcome, I don't, there's this view of media, a circle that says media. And in there are three buckets. One says print, one says broadcast, and now one says internet. That is the media view of the world. I utterly disagree with that now. I think that there is instead an internet view of the world, a world in which we are all connected, people to information, people to people, information to information, machines to machines. We call it the internet now, but it's a new reality around connectivity and data. So what does that look like? Well, inside that circle is already something called social that was born there. And communications has been utterly sucked inside there. And media is being sucked in there right now a lot faster than it was 3 months ago. Education was almost outside, and now it's being sucked out. As a teacher, we're teaching our classes in the internet. Finance is being sucked into this. Crime is being sucked into this. All kinds of functions, government as well, are being brought into the gravity of the black hole of the internet. And that's the view of the world that we need to understand and think about as we reinvent every segment of society that Sebastian's put together in this discussion. It's not as if we are separate domains anymore. We are now part of a connected world. There's no two ways around that. And as some institutions are tested and fail either because they don't have the moral standing to operate in this world or because they don't have the business models and the innovation to operate in this world, they'll be replaced. They'll be replaced haphazardly with small efforts, but we will try to figure out how to rebuild from those ashes. And the one thing I want to see us do in journalism is not try to recreate what we were. We should never have thought of ourselves as a factory manufacturing a product called content. Journalism is a service. It is a service that helps people improve their lives and communities improve themselves. And that's what journalism and media have to be going forward. So I'm grateful to Sebastian for this opportunity. That's what I have to say, and I'm eager for conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really great. And so I think this is going to be leading right into the panel, which will start in a little bit. So, I mean, I'd like to start this off with one question. So you mentioned at the beginning that the abundance of scientific information is there, and scientists now have access to the public. and journalists have access to those scientists as well. But what do you do about? Well, there's a couple of things. So one, like, what do you do about distrust in scientists or distrust in sort of scientific information that is, somewhat predominant in society? And the other thing, and we're being affected by this right now. You pointed out earlier that my YouTube live stream went offline. I presume that's probably because somewhere in there YouTube flagged it as being against guidelines because we're talking about COVID-19. How do we deal with appropriate censorship? Because certain information perhaps should and can be censored, and I know that you have some interesting views on that. But how do we appropriately make sure that people get the right information and information that is true and accurate?
It's not an easy answer to your first question. The only answer to how people trust science is education. And right now we live in a time of a lack of trust in institutions, including education, and that can be fatal. I think we're seeing now that if people really believe they can drink bleach because an idiot tells them so, that's fatal. And how do we bring back a notion of trust in institutions and science? I think is by having to demonstrate the value of it. So I think that the journalism now has to demonstrate the value of expertise, the value of science, and bring us back to that all the time. And quote those experts and explain why they have what they have. And we've got to do a better job of explaining. In terms of control in an open, so it's not just we're in an open information ecosystem. We are in an open conversation. James Carey, who's the late professor of journalism at Columbia, talks about how society is a conversation, democracy is a conversation, journalism should be informed by that conversation so it can inform it back. So we've got to recognize that everybody's talking, right? Twitter is not the New York Times, it's Times Square. And as you walk, well, now you walk through Times Square, you hear nothing. But on a normal day soon, you'll hear smart people and you'll hear idiots. That's the microcosm that is society. And so I think it's a dire mistake for governments to expect platforms to edit conversations as if they were publications. This is the problem of thinking things are media. If you think they're media, then you think that they can be edited and controlled and packaged. No, it's a conversation that we have to add value to. We've got to find ways to bring scientists and experts and educators into the conversation so that we can try to inform it. Now, some number of people are lost to that. Yes. And we can't try to think in mass terms that we have to get everybody all the same. But in this crisis, I have to believe that a lot of the people who have done things that I would consider ill-informed before now recognize that their lives depend upon reliable answers in science. This is our opportunity to show that value.
Excellent. I'm going to open up for questions now. We've got about 15 minutes left before the panel. So let's open it up. Raise your hand if you have a question. There's lots of questions in the Q&A. And also, Griff Green, you're asking questions in the chat. All right, I'm going to go ahead here. All right, Louis, you got the mic.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so a bit earlier you mentioned Spaceship Media, I think, as a project which is innovating in the space. I'm wondering if you have other examples of people to follow or projects to follow who are addressing the problems that you've been mentioning and trying to add value to foster, to kind of emphasize islands of expertise on different topics to innovate in media.
Not enough, I don't think. If you look at smart organizations like ProPublica, the City in New York, Texas Tribune, if you look at some of the startups in Europe like El Diario, De Correspondent, you see efforts to reconfigure how the conversation operates and how we interact with the public. And I'm very enthused about all of those. I had the privilege of starting a new degree with my colleague Carrie Brown at the Newmark School called Social Journalism. By the way, we're going to reopen applications because everybody's life has changed imminently. So if anybody's interested, let me know. And its precept is that you start not with content, not with a story idea, not with trying to get an audience. You start with communities that are self-defined, and you observe and listen to and reflect and empathize with those communities before you can figure out what they need. It's almost anthropological more than journalistic. And I think we have to have that view of communities now. One of the fears I have in the COVID story is we're talking in very cold terms about huge numbers of people who are dying. We were looking at excess mortality, which is a very important calculation, but it's a chilling phrase. And we've got to value communities, especially in this time when underserved and underrepresented communities, African Americans, Latino Americans, disabled Americans, and people around the world in places like India and Africa with less robust healthcare are going to suffer. So we've got to figure out how to serve those communities in new ways. I wish I had more examples for you, really, but I don't.
Thank you so much. Great. Can I ask a second question, or do I have to pass it on?
You've got the mic.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So short question. I'm really like journalism newbie. What is a good peer review to you, or what is good practice in terms of like peer review? You said like we have to peer review what is published and have to peer review the people who peer review. That really interested me.
To me, that was new. When I started the Twitter list, I looked for credentials. Twitter then came to me and asked for help in trying to identify scientists to get the blue check mark. And they were looking at whether they had credentials, whether they seemed to have relevant experience, whether they had a tie to a trusted institution. It surprisingly isn't that hard. You also see quickly who trusts each other. And it became evident that I could tell that here are 5 or 6 epidemiologists who link to each other regularly, who come from places like Yale, so an institution, whom I trust, and I see who they criticize. So social media, which is lambasted for ruining all of our brains, I think does the opposite. It opens up the possibility to hear new voices. I'm worried about amplifying the voices of expertise. The next thing I want to concentrate on is amplifying the voices of underrepresented communities in this crisis.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That kind of reminds me that we do have these systems, like for example, in encryption and with regards to PGP, the web of trust has existed for a long time. And if we could replicate this kind of system at scale, leveraging Twitter or social media, where we could create sort of these webs of trust among smart people and represent that and have it in a way that's easily representable so that people can see, I think that'd be like extremely valuable.
There's a new company called Sage, started by Samir Arora, that's trying to worry about webs of expertise. He did it around the travel industry and destinations. Well, that's been on hold now. But I know Jack Dorsey has talked about how if you open sourced what social media is and then added layers of value on top of that, I think that's going to be the next phase of this. It means making judgments. The platforms and journalists, to an extent, are somewhat allergic to making judgments because there's this myth of neutrality. Well, no, you've got to decide that scientist knows more than that one and has better credentials than that one, and then build from there.
Harry Halpin, you've got the mic.
Yeah, great to finally see you online, Jeff. I actually left a CUNY tenure track job to work on a blockchain startup on privacy, of all things. And I'm interested in how you feel about these kinds of latest technological developments in journalism, the age of Corona. So, leaks are quite controversial. You have, WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, and this is kind of one kind of traditional journalism. But also now we're seeing huge fights on Twitter and in journalism over the right way to interpret Corona data. And, can we have more open data? What do you think the future is of data and journalism in the age of Corona and science? Should we allow people who aren't qualified scientists to be doing data work or leaking data? I mean, what's the line there?
Well, what do you say? Once the data is out there, how we interpret it. There was a famous case in the last few weeks of a growth hacker who said, I know data, so I can do as well as any epidemiologist, and wrote a piece on Medium that was full of crap. And Medium, to its credit, took it down. The criticism was widely held. It got put up elsewhere, but Medium said, we're not going to stand for that. In the case of the New York Times story about the preprint that I mentioned from Santa Clara, we should have a simple standard about how we report on these things. And so even though we may not be qualified to analyze the data, we should go to at least 2 or 3 experts who are not the authors of the paper and not related to it, get other perspectives and other views. I'm working on a project we call News Q. Full disclosure is funded by Facebook, trying to worry about the standard quality in news reporting. And we're going to start with science. And that's one of the obvious standards we need to have. Third, I would say that we also see cases of papers coming out. There were 2 doctors in Bakersfield, California, who on the basis of their practice only held a press conference, and they got quoted. Well, the scientists went nuts on that because they didn't release any data. They didn't have any data, and the journalists were just taking this stuff. So the journalists should expect that data is released openly so it can be questioned, which I think is important. So we need to set higher standards for how we operate. I'm not hearing you, Sebastian.
Daniel, you've got the mic.
Great, thank you. I think it's a follow-up on this discussion, but on the level of on the issue of expertise, being a scientist myself, an epidemiologist, but not an infectious disease epidemiologist, but a chronic disease epidemiologist. I was so surprised with this wave of armchair epidemiologists, people, physicists, or people in quantitative scientists suddenly making all sorts of models. When I was thinking, as an epidemiologist, I know this stuff from my degree, but I'm not confident enough to jump into infectious disease from chronic disease epidemiology, and all these people are just jumping in and making the models of their own. So. And these are people who may be real experts in their area of physics or quantitative finance or whichever area they normally tweet and communicate about. But then suddenly in epidemiology, they make a lot of assumptions that don't hold, or they make models that and start extrapolating when that's not possible, or don't question the sources of the raw data. So I was wondering what your opinion is on that, how can you separate trust from the person, because a person may be very trustworthy on one topic and that doesn't always translate to other topics.
Daniel, that's the perfect question. When I interviewed the 4 scientists that I interviewed, an epidemiologist, an infectious diseases doctor, a virologist, and a geneticist, the first question I asked them is, what should we ask you? What is your expertise? What are you qualified to speak to? And I find, as in your case, as you just proved, a good scientist will always say, this is what I'm qualified to talk for, and this is what is outside my realm. And every one of the scientists I've talked to when they've been on media have been frustrated that they get asked questions that have nothing to do with their expertise. And so they have to say, I don't know, you're asking the wrong person. The armchair epidemiology is really fascinating because, like that growth hacker, there are others who think if they can understand data, they can do this too. They can do your job, and they can't. But the danger is the New York Times handed over a major op-ed space to someone who has some epidemiological training, but primarily works in nutrition and defends the sugar industry and is an advisor to the California Walnut Board. They gave this person huge space early on in the pandemic to say, oh, the cure is worse than the disease, and to do that without any basis. All the epidemiologists I saw who understood what they were talking about had fits about this. Greg Gonsalves at Yale has been a trenchant critic of this kind of coverage. And he had a fit saying, why did you hand over this space to someone who's not truly qualified? And the danger is this too went out and into Donald Trump's brain and others who were trying to say it's not so bad. And then 2 columnists of the New York Times quoted him, including Tom Friedman today, quoted him once again saying, well, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe Sweden's just fine. That is armchair epidemiology. That's dangerous ignorance. And so we've got to have a higher standard for bookers and editors and journalists to understand how to go to people with the right credentials and then test them. Right? If I came to you and I asked you questions about this and you said, sorry, I may be an epidemiologist, but I'm not qualified to answer that. Here's why, and here's who you should go to. then the next time I need a question in your area, I'm going to trust you because you had the honesty and the transparency to say what you're qualified in. And I think most scientists are like you. There are a few who aren't, and most journalists don't understand how to ask that question of you scientists.
Great. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I think we can take one last question before we move to the panel. Any of these people who've asked questions in the Q&A box? Oh, we have one here. All right. Go ahead. Sarigama? Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
Hello.
Hi. Go ahead.
Hi. So I'm from India, and with one of my friends, we started this initiative called COVID Wire. We wanted to take information from all the newspapers like Guardian, BBC, and all the authentic sources to people who are not capable of reaching out to these news channels. For example, people like my grandmother who cannot read English. So we wanted we had like a mechanism where we have news curators and then digesters and translators. So we ask them to digest it into small summaries so that we translate them into local languages and then we communicate it to whosoever is possible. So this is in a beta version currently, and we are having a huge trouble in curation of news in the sense that we do not know how to be sure that we are not communicating something that's wrong because yeah. So is there any pointers that you would like to give to us? I am a master's student in research. So yeah, this is our small initiative.
They're great work and important work, and I'm glad you're doing that. I'm also glad that a lot of news organizations are opening up their COVID coverage to make it possible for you around their paywalls. There is some very good work from science journalists who have standards on how this should be reported. And I have that in my bookmarks. If you will DM me, I'm at Jeff Jarvis, JEFFJARVIS, on Twitter. DM me and remind me of this. And I cut through all of the spam DMs. I'll find you and I'll send you some of those links. And please send me back your link so I can look at COVID Wire when it's up.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can take one final question before the panel.
I see a question here about the conversation, which pairs journalists and academics. And I think that's really more important than ever now. The idea behind the conversation is that universities want to get their research out. They don't think they're the best at communicating. They bring journalists in, and the journalists and the scientists work as partners to get it right. And I think that's a really interesting and productive model for the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was an amazing